Zatem zaczynamy. Witam
Therefore, let's get started. Hello to all of you, all those gathered in front of your computer screens. I'm really happy to have this meeting. As we know, the pandemic's time has made it difficult to maintain contacts, direct contacts, but technological achievements have made it possible to make the best of cutting-edge communication methods. And this observation pertains in its specific way to the institutions that are deeply anchored in multi-level communication. A university, or the university, is one of such institutions. We can speak about society in its entirety and about the church too. This is the communication-based community. We are experiencing very tense time, and this is the examination on mutual communication. Today's meeting will foster the purpose of mutual communication. A very warm words of welcome to Professor George Weigel from Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., a respected, a world-known theologian, a journalist, columnist, author of many books. Professor, I am really glad that you have accepted our invitation to deliver the lecture on social teaching of Saint John Paul II, as well as to participate in the discussion that is going to follow the lecture. So I wish to reverberate my words of thanks. It's wonderful. We are celebrating a centenary of Pope's birthday, and therefore we are given a chance to listen to the lecture of one of the greatest experts on his pontificate. Hello and welcome to Father Archbishop Wiktor Skworc, Father Archbishop Senior Damian Zimon, and Auxiliary Bishop Adam Wodarczyk. Madam Vice Rector for Staff Development, Professor Ewa Jarosz. Hello and welcome to you. What we are doing today is building a communication bridge, which somehow relates in a symbolical way to activity of the great Pope. We have guests from Poland, but also from many other countries. I want to greet each and every one of you. First, I'd like to mention that there are people from 15 countries outside Poland, and I will name these countries, and those participating in the meeting who live in distant countries will feel addressed personally. We've got Great Britain, Belgium, Czech Republic, Spain, Lithuania, Germany, Portugal, Romania, Slovakia, Ukraine, Italy, Argentina, Mexico, USA, and Kenya. About 200 participants have registered for the meeting. These are Polish representatives who represent 21 higher education institutions, being universities and other organizations. Cordial greetings to each and every one of you. And now the floor goes to Archbishop Wiktor Skworc. I'd like to express my gratitude for being given this possibility to speak. Thank you, Father Dean. Special thanks to the Theological Department of our University, Silesian University, for this initiative and organizing this virtual meeting. This is the lecture of Professor Weigel. We are going to listen to his presentation on social teaching, John Paul II. Professor, wholehearted welcome to you. I wish to express my profound gratitude for the possibility of meeting. Welcome to Katowice. Hello to all other participants of our meeting. When I realized that this is an exceptional meeting we are taking part in, because Professor is in Washington, and there are participants in different corners of the world, it makes me realize that we are a part of a global village. Albert McLuhan was right. In 1962, in his Gutenberg's Galaxy book, he described the trends, and he could foresee the situation that the digital media do away with time and space barriers. People communicate on global scale, so we make the best use of these possibilities. So hello and welcome to the global village. Saying hello from Katowice. In 2018, Katowice hosted the climate summit COP24. And a little digression, Father Dean. How about the next topic for the conference? Let's talk about ecology and climate. Professor Weigel won't be speaking about ecology, he'll be speaking about social teaching of Pope John Paul II, preceded by the social teaching of Archbishop Karol Wojtyła. He was preaching from Piekary Sanctuary of the Mother of Social Justice and Love. It is Upper Silesia region, Poland. I am the representative of this generation. I've had the chance to be in this sanctuary twice. I had the possibility of listening to Karol Wojtyła's teaching, very much up to date, very much referring to specific context. In 1983, Pope John Paul II was amongst us here in Katowice. It was Muchowiec Airport. It was the gospel of labor. He confirmed the right of employees to enjoy the right to have labor unions or trade unions. It's been less than 40 years since then. Let me use this opportunity to speak about local problems, because it has been 40 years since then. Today's inhabitants of Upper Silesia have experienced a feeling of uncertainty. This is related to the decarbonization process. There's already a roadmap in place, and the deadline has already been set. It's 2049. In today's situation, you need to be brave. You need to give these people a life rope, love, social awareness, Catholic teaching of the Church. Otherwise, other way of application of John Paul II's teaching, so that it pertains to our local problems and issues, because local problems and issues mean the end of a specific era. Professor, all the participants of today's meeting, you are kindly requested to support me in this joint teaching to prosper for answers in this global and local problems, and to put it in the light of the social Catholic teaching, and especially teaching of great Pope John Paul II. Because work and man always remain, and the relations of the two were described. Work has got its value because it is the deed of man. It is important that man does the work for others, for somebody else. Professor, I'd like to express my gratitude for your work that you do to benefit us. I'm unable to stay until the end of this hugely interesting meeting because other obligations have made it impossible. So may this be a peaceful time of Christmas, and my greetings, local greetings, by John II. Blessings of God. Thank you very much, Archbishop, for this introductory word and the context. Thank you for giving some food for thought for discussion that will follow the presentation. And now the floor goes to Deputy Rector Ewa Janosz, who's been unable to join us for the meeting. Therefore, the next point on our agenda today is the second series of Lectio Magistralis Internationalis, organized by our Chair of Theology, Mariola Kozubek, a PhD Spiritus Movens of this series. She's the Assistant Professor in Pedagogy. She's a member of Christian Pedagogy Group operating under the Committee of Pedagogical Research at the Polish Academy of Sciences. She's a member of AVE-PRO, the Holy See Agency for Evaluation and Promotion of Quality and Education at Church and Universities and Faculties. So the floor goes to Dr. Mariola Kozubek. Father Dean, thank you very much for this word of introduction, and thank you very much for being a part of this meeting. The Lectio Magistralis Internationalis project was created just a few months ago. We were trying to prosper, to find the new forms of academic exchange of ideas in the situation we are all facing, because the academic world in all corners of the world was put to halt, kind of. Therefore, we made the best use of cutting-edge technologies and virtual space. These have facilitated the possibility of cooperation. The goal of the project is to create space to develop a community of being and acting together, as it was defined by Karol Weigel. The former is more difficult because it requires very personal commitment. And this personal commitment is expressed through self-opening, self-revelation, self-sacrifice, or self-donation. This leads to a union that becomes the foundation of our mutual actions. A meaningful action always requires determination of its objective. And in the context of this very project, seeking the truth together is the goal that brings us all together. Many of you joined the first edition of the project. It was Professor Massimo Borghesi from Perugia University. The fact that you are also present at today's lecture gives us hope that we shall continue these activities in the future. We'll be creating this community of action. One of the salient features of this Lectio Magistralis project, so international project, is this very international dimension. What has already been said today, I'd like to express my profound gratitude to Professor Weigel for joining us, because so many of you have been brought together for this meeting. We've got the representatives of Polish and international milieux. We're going to have two parts. There'll be the master's presentation. Professor Weigel will deliver a speech at the beginning, and then we are going to have three professors' presentations who will be sharing their reflections on the lecture we've just heard. And after that part, we are going to have a short break. And in the second part of our webinar, we'll have the possibility of asking questions. Our audience will be allowed to pose their questions. So you can use the chat option. This is the place you can pose your question. And we are going to finish at about 6 Polish time. So may we co-create this unity of being through listening and being open to what will be given. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the floor goes to Dr. Aleksandra Kłodzka-Skrzypczak, Junior Professor at Theological Department of Silesia University. For 10 years, she's been focusing on the United States in her research. Professor George Weigel has opened the gate of his scientific world to our colleague, to Dr. Aleksandra Kłos-Skrzypczak. Doctor's PhD research was carried out in First Things editorial house. She's into American neoconservative moral theology and the condition of the family in American society. Madam Doctor, thank you very much for being a part of this project, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kozubek. It is with great pleasure that I have this opportunity to tell you about our distinguished guest, Professor George Weigel, one of the leading authorities of the Catholic Church in the world, the most interesting American scientist, Roman Catholic Church analyst, one of the most renowned commentators of religious and public life, a highly intellectual and at the same time thoroughly accessible writer. This is what the American media have written about our guest. Ladies and gentlemen, George Weigel completed his BA studies at St. Mary's Seminary at University in Baltimore and his master's degree from St. Michael's College in Toronto. Since the end of the 1980s, he has been associated with the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., where he is the head of the William Edward Simon Chair in the Catholic program of those studies. George Weigel is an excellent American Catholic writer, social activist, political activist, theologian, author of over 20 books, including the best-selling 2-volume biography of Pope John Paul II, Witness to Hope and the End and the Beginning. It is worth mentioning the fact on this occasion. And also, Robert Sirica, founder of the Action Institute, recalls that many years ago, he was invited by Judge Weigel to the New York apartment of a mutual friend, Richard Nauhaus. And in that apartment, Professor Weigel showed a letter, a handwritten letter in which the Holy Father, John Paul II, asks George Weigel to undertake the work and prepare his biography. As Robert Sirica recalls, such things do not happen very often. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor George Weigel is appreciated not only in the United States, but all over the globe. He has received 18 honorary doctorates, was awarded the Papal Cross Pro Ecclesia at Pontificia, and the Polish Golden Medal for Merit to Culture, Gloria Artis. He is a member of the advisory board of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, sits on the board of the Institute for Religion and Public Life, which publishes the ecumenical opinion-forming journal First Things. Professor Weigel's essays, reviews, and many commentaries regularly appear in leading American magazines and newspapers. He is also a Vatican analyst in NBC News, and his weekly commentary in the Catholic Difference column is represented in 85 newspapers and magazines in 7 countries around the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the masterclass. Professor George Weigel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Kłos-Skrzypczak. It's very nice to be back in Katowice. I've enjoyed my visits there in the past. I hope circumstances will allow me to return in person in the not too distant future. I have long hoped that the social doctrine of John Paul II would be studied with greater care and intensity in his native Poland and indeed throughout the world. And I hope that this fine initiative by the University of Silesia in Katowice helps advance that cause. What I would like to do for the next 40 minutes or so is to offer an overview of the social doctrine of John Paul II, allowing the discussion period to be the opportunity to draw out some of the contemporary implications of that social doctrine. But for those participating around the world who may not be quite as familiar with this idea of a Catholic social doctrine as some others, let me just say a brief word of introduction to what it is we're talking about here. Modern Catholic social thought begins in the mid-19th century, primarily in Central Europe, although in other parts of the Catholic world as well. And after some decades of intellectual development, this distinctively Catholic way of thinking about society, politics, economics, culture, and their interaction began to have a decisive effect on the magisterium of the popes. And so it is in 1891 that Pope Leo XIII, elected to the See of St. Peter precisely 100 years before Karol Wojtyła, Leo XIII initiates what we properly call Catholic social doctrine, a body of thought that developed over the next century and more in response to particular challenges, and as an effort to open a conversation at a high intellectual level between the Catholic Church and modern political, social, economic, and cultural thought. This Catholic social doctrine had, at the time of the election of John Paul II, three foundational principles. The first two of those were articulated by Pope Leo XIII in 1891 in the first papal encyclical in the Catholic social doctrine tradition. The encyclical was called Rerum Novarum, and its reference to the new things of the modern world was a reference to the Industrial Revolution, the urbanization of society, the decline of the old political regimes and the rise of new forms of political life. And in response to those, Leo XIII offered a distinctively Catholic view of what the rightly ordered society would look like, drawing extensively from his long study of the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. And in that encyclical Rerum Novarum of 1891, Pope Leo laid the first two foundational principles of Catholic social doctrine. The first of these we usually refer to in the theological community as the personalism principle. In more contemporary political science language, we might call this the human rights principle. And according to this principle, as articulated by Pope Leo, all right thinking about society, politics, economics, culture, and their interaction begins with the individual human person and his or her innate dignity and inalienable value. Which is to say, right thinking about society does not begin with the tribe or the ethnic group or the racial group or the gender group. It begins with the individual human person made in the image and likeness of God with reason and free will. In that encyclical Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo immediately complemented that first personalist principle with a second principle, the principle of the common good, or what we might call in more contemporary language, the communitarian principle. And according to this principle, each of us should exercise those inalienable human rights that are ours by reason of that innate dignity and value that is part of our human nature. Each of us should exercise those rights in such a way as to benefit society as a whole, not simply to benefit me as an individual. So right from the beginning of the social doctrine, we see what some have called the classic Catholic both and. Catholic social thought is not so much either or, but both and. So both personalism and the common good, both human rights and the community which should live its life in solidarity. 40 years after Rerum Novarum in 1931, Pope Pius XI, who, as our Polish colleagues will remember, was the first papal representative to the reconstituted Polish Republic in 1919 and 1920, issued the second great encyclical in the Catholic social doctrine tradition called Quadragesimo Anno, which, as its title indicates, was written to mark the 40th anniversary of the publication of Rerum Novarum. Quadragesimo Anno was a response to a new set of challenges. As Rerum Novarum responded to the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, the decline of the old regimes, Quadragesimo Anno was a response to the rise of totalitarianism. And Mussolini's famous definition of that project as everything within the state, nothing outside the state, everything for the state. In contrast to that unitary totalitarian view, Pope Pius XI articulated a richly pluralistic view of a rightly ordered society, emphasizing the many layers of a properly ordered society, from the national level to the local level to the familial level, and articulating this principle of subsidiarity, according to which decision-making should be left at the lowest possible level in society, that is closest to those most affected by a decision, commensurate with the common good. A very simple illustration of this: the national government is not responsible for the local fire department. The local fire department is the responsibility of local government. Conversely, national defense must be the responsibility of the national government. So multiple layers of authority in a rightly ordered society. And this principle of subsidiarity we can also call the principle of civil society, because Pope Pius's concept of subsidiarity included non-governmental organizations and natural associations like the family, as well as governmental structures in a hierarchy. Now, that's the material with which John Paul II set to work in articulating his own social doctrine. His first social encyclical, issued in 1981 for the 90th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, was called Laborum Exercens, and it offered the church and the world a rich phenomenology of work in which the Pope taught that work is not, as some Catholic popular piety had it for decades, even centuries, work is not punishment for original sin. Rather, work is our participation in God's ongoing creation of the world. This is a deeply Thomistic idea. God's creation of the world did not end on the seventh day. As St. Thomas reminds us in the Summa Theologiae, if God wanted to end the world, God would not have to do something, God would have to stop doing something. Work is our participation in God's ongoing creation of the world, and therefore, John Paul II writes, work is not only a matter of making more or having more, work is a matter of being more. Work is a way of deepening and ennobling our humanity. A very interesting thought from the first pope in centuries, who had himself been a manual laborer in his work in Krakow during the Nazi occupation of the Second World War. Because of all of this, John Paul argues in Laborum Exercens, work has a spiritual dimension. Work is simply not a physical matter or a mental matter. Work has a spiritual dimension. In his second social encyclical, 1987, Sollicitudo Rei Socialis, the Pope made two important points about the contested field of international development, especially third world development. The first point was that development has a moral and cultural, not only material, character. One measures the development of societies, nations, and peoples not simply by gross national product, but by quality of life understood in moral and cultural terms. Secondly, in Sollicitudo Rei Socialis, John Paul II spoke of a right to economic initiative. Part of the creativity of the human person that reflects the creativity of God himself is economic creativity, entrepreneurship, the ability to imagine something new and to bring that idea to economic fruition for the benefit of others. It was, however, in John Paul II's third social encyclical, Centesimus Annus, 1991, written as the title suggests for the centenary of Rerum Novarum, that the Pope gave us the most developed statement of the Catholic social doctrine tradition that has been written to date. And in that encyclical, he articulated 6 key themes. First, the free and virtuous society of the 21st century and the third millennium would have 3 interlocking and interactive parts: a democratic polity, a democratically organized state, if you will, a free economy, and a robust public moral culture. And it's the third of those, that robust, vigorous, sturdy public moral culture, that is the key to the whole edifice. Why? Because free politics and free economics set loose tremendous human energies. It takes a vibrant public moral culture to discipline and direct those energies so that the net result is individual human flourishing and social solidarity. The second key theme in Centesimus Annus is that democracy and the market, the free market, are not machines that can run by themselves. Rather, John Paul II teaches it takes a certain kind of people living certain virtues to make the machinery of democracy and the market produce human flourishing and social solidarity. It's important to get the machinery of governance and the machinery of economic life properly designed, but that's not enough. It takes a certain kind of people living certain virtues to make that machinery work properly. And here we come back again to that third sector of the free and virtuous society, the public moral culture, for it is there, in that culture, that the habits of heart and mind, the virtues necessary to live freedom nobly, are formed. And the primary task of the church in this vision of John Paul II is to shape that public moral culture through evangelization and the catechesis, the religious education of virtuous citizens. The church's task is not, in other words, to design public policy. Pope says quite explicitly that is not the competence of the church. The church is to shape the public moral culture that shapes politics and economics by forming, through evangelization and catechesis, virtuous citizens. One implication of this is that the church must never allow itself to become identified with one political party exclusively. The church speaks across the full spectrum of political and economic life to the entire citizenry of a society. The third key theme in Centesimus Annus is that freedom must be tethered to truth, tied to truth, and ordered to goodness, aimed at goodness, if freedom is not to self-destruct. This seems to me an absolutely essential point to make in the current condition of the Western world, where freedom is often misunderstood as sheer willfulness. I did it my way, as Frank Sinatra used to say. That is not a mature understanding of freedom. Freedom lived nobly means doing the right thing for the right reason as a matter of moral habit or virtue. And in public life, freedom means, as John Paul II said in a homily in my native city of Baltimore in 1995, freedom is having the right to do what we ought, which means that it is an obligation of the state to recognize in constitutional and positive law the moral truths built into the world and into us, which we can know by reason. Fourth key theme in Centesimus Annus, natural and voluntary associations, the family, non-governmental organizations, businesses, trade unions, religious communities. Natural and voluntary associations are essential to the free and virtuous society. These are what the Pope calls the first schools of freedom. For this is where those virtuous citizens who can live freedom nobly, who can make the machinery of democracy and the market work properly are first formed. I often explain this to audiences in the United States by reference to my young grandchildren. Every 2-year-old who has ever lived in this world is a natural tyrant. There is no such thing as a 2-year-old Democrat. Every 2-year-old is a beautiful bundle of willfulness. I want this, I want it now, I want it my way now. Where do those little 2-year-old tyrants become transformed into mature adults who can live freedom nobly? That happens first in the family, then it happens in schools, in voluntary associations like scouting organizations, in the church. These natural and voluntary associations are the schools of freedom that express what John Paul II calls in Centesimus Annus the subjectivity of society. And in those schools of freedom, we first learn the virtue of solidarity, which is the fourth foundational principle of classic Catholic social doctrine. The fifth and sixth key themes in Centesimus Annus address post-industrial economic life. The first of these, the fifth great theme in the encyclical, is that wealth in the late 20th century and early 21st century can no longer be understood in material terms alone. For example, the possession of land or the ownership of mineral resources. Rather, wealth in the post-industrial economic world, John Paul II teaches, is located in human creativity and entrepreneurship. A perfect example of this is silicon. Silicon has existed on this planet for billions of years, and it was essentially worthless. It had no economic value until the last 50 years. And then human creativity was applied to silicon. And the microchip was invented, and we all have these things, and we are able to talk to each other around the world today because human creativity was applied to a previously worthless substance, transforming that substance into a source of enormous wealth. All of this indicates, John Paul II teaches, that wealth is not static. Wealth increases in a properly run economy. This brings us to the sixth point. If wealth is fixed and static, as it was for most of human history, then the primary moral question becomes the equitable, just distribution of a static amount of wealth. If, on the other hand, wealth is dynamic, wealth increases, then the primary moral question is one of inclusion in the process of wealth creation and wealth distribution. That's the key shift in economic life to which John Paul II is responding in Centesimus Annus. Poverty in the post-industrial world is a matter of exclusion, of people being left out of the circles of production and exchange where wealth is created, grows, and is distributed. That means that anti-poverty programs should be programs of empowerment, empowering the poor to exercise their own economic creativity and become fully participant in society. Thus, the Pope urges in Centesimus Annus that we not think of poor people as a problem to be solved, but as people with potential to be unleashed. That's Centesimus Annus. Finally, in two later encyclicals, not social encyclicals properly speaking, but encyclicals with social impact, John Paul II made important contributions to the further development of Catholic social thought and the social doctrine of the Church. First, in the 1993 encyclical Veritatis Splendor on the reform of Catholic moral theology, the Pope asked an interesting question. Every democratic society has as its most basic principle the equality of everyone before the law. All are equal before the law. How do we know that? Our common everyday experience is that people are unequal. Some people are more beautiful than other people. Some people are more athletically gifted than other people. Some people are more intelligent than other people. Some people can paint beautiful pictures, and there are people like me who cannot draw a circle properly on a piece of paper. Our natural experience is human inequality. So how can we justify the claim of equality within society that is a foundation stone of every democratic society? Pope makes a very important point. The most defensible ground of human equality is the equality of everyone before the natural moral law and the obligation of everyone to avoid intrinsically evil acts. That's the ground, the most secure ground or foundation of human equality. That's a great topic for someone's doctoral dissertation, I might add. It's a very intriguing contribution to democratic political theory that deserves to be explored in more depth. Finally, in the 1995 encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the Pope makes several important points for Catholic social doctrine while discussing the gospel of life. The first point is that actions which we can know by reason to be wrong cannot be defined as rights. And when the state attempts to do that, the state is making a serious mistake that undercuts the democratic project. If wrongs are defined as rights, then a society risks what John Paul II's successor, Benedict XVI, would call the dictatorship of relativism, meaning the imposition of a relativistic moral scheme on all of society. And that means that what John Paul II called in Evangelium Vitae the culture of life is essential to democracy. A culture that cherishes the gift of life is essential to the democratic project. That, in a very schematic overview, is the social doctrine of John Paul II. I believe it is the most interesting and comprehensive proposal for thinking about the future of free societies that is available in the world today. And I hope that this project at the University of Silesia in Katowice helps bring this social doctrine to wider attention in Poland, in Europe, and indeed throughout the world. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękujemy panu profesorowi za fascynujące przedłożenie.
Thank you, Professor, for this truly fascinating presentation. I feel motivated to go into deep into this thought. This is the moment to prepare your questions. And when you have a question, you can use the Q&A icon. So pin in your question. The floor is open for questions. Make use of this icon. We'll be reading out the questions for Professor, and we'll seek the answer in the second part. There is also a request not to record this material, make it public. We, the organizers, will prepare materials after the conference. Ladies and gentlemen, time for a short discussion. We've got wonderful professors who will be sharing the first reflections of the professor's lecture, and they will pose their questions. I'd like to present Dr. Wiesław Gumuła, professor of Jagiellonian University.
Uniwersytetu Jagiellońskiego. W swoim życiorysie naukowym może wykazać się pracą w Akademii Górniczo-Hutniczej, Szkole Głównej Handlowej, Uniwersytecie Marii Skłodowskiej czy Katolickim Uniwersytecie Lubelskim. Zajmuje się socjologią finansów, osobliwościami społecznymi i zmianami ustrojowymi w naszym kraju.
He's into sociology, finances, and changes in our country, broadly defined social relations. Professor, the floor is yours. Professor Weigel, ladies and gentlemen, I was listening to Master's presentation very attentively. And there was one thing that was pretty striking, and this is what I want to underline here. Social doctrine of John Paul II used this notion. We in Poland use social teaching of John Paul II. This way, Professor has highlighted a very important thing. In John Paul II teaching, this normative normative side is very important. The documents that contain teachings are very often created this way. I don't like something, so doctrine assumes some kind of critical approach. His teaching is critical. He says this needs changing, and there is lots of positive thinking because he says it should be done this way or that way. Therefore, Pope proposes specific changes. This well-defined normativism is very well associated with the notion of teaching that assumes this principle. Not only do we have the explanation of the reality, the interpretation and description of reality, but also it triggers the changes. It is clearly visible in Redemptor Hominis, the first encyclical, where Pope said, man is the way of the church. Not only is the description of the status of man, status of human ontological status, but there is also a specific program. You reach the divine through man. In Misericordia, he says about complementary love, justice. Not only do we indicate a relation, because when there is no love, there is no justice, but there is a specific injunction for us of social life. If you want to be members of the society, you need to learn to love. Laborum Excelsis, I would say it's more clearly visible to show this doctrinal aspect. There is no work before the capital. So we indicate specific things. It assumes a specific image of the world. The image of the world that John Paul II recognized and disliked. He was a prophet himself. So there is this primacy that is a very important principle. And another encyclical, Solicitudo Rei Socialis, where John Paul II presents this very operational way of the two most important principles that he was struggling intellectually: personalism principle and the solidarity principle. So these are the indicators how to develop well-being of the societies without giving up on human personalism, subjectivity. Man is an agent at a specific level, because God's grace is also very much needed to demonstrate it. It has been highlighted, but this is very important aspect. This is this kind of personalistic point of view. And there's this solidarity attitude, solidarity theme. Not only am I the one that acts, but also I live with other people, next to other people. I'm part of the society, part of the neighborhood, of the family, of the nation, of international society. All kinds of communities stand a chance. So we should be associated with them without giving up on higher levels of integration, which take this universalism principle. I'd like to say a few words about labor priority over capital. It's been clearly said, it's a good diagnosis of a social life. Not only is work the source of self-fulfillment of man, but work is very often a distracting factor. Other people may distract man by their work, by their activities, by pushing man to do things the man does not want to do. And the dignity of work is a derivative of human dignity. So this is this personalism. So these are the ontological notions that lead to specific directives or injunctions to respect work. Work should be respected because man, living human being, human person is the basis of work, and the world of things is associated with possession. We are supposed to manage the world, not to be dominated by what is happening on earth. It has been touched upon on numerous occasions. You can find it in writings of John Paul II about just work, predatory capitalism, destructive for the capital and for work and labor. I'd like to refer to two themes: attitude to Marxism, theological. This doctrine is associated with ethical notions that have been justified with great injustice at the beginning of the first part of the 19th century. It was very much associated with the then system. There is the disagreement to what John Paul II had the chance to see in Poland and other socialist countries. He criticized this doctrine for this imperfect concept of man, for totalitarianism, for abuse that was pretty clear here. On the other hand, we need the other support leg, the intellectual one. John Paul II also refers to the neoliberal doctrine. He can see positive things. Capitalism is the proper way of human relations management, because we've got the entrepreneurship, we've got private ownership, because we take care of the results of human work. But on the other hand, there is no agreement to this predatory capitalism that infringes human dignity. So there is this opposition against ignoring poverty, abuse, social inequalities. 3 years ago, I was participating in a Vatican's conference organized by Centesimus Annes. Pope Francis spoke about mercifulness that fulfills and equals everything. I'd put it this way: you can see this attitude you give the right place to capital owners and those who are in the world of work. So this doctrine is leading towards social economics of the market, but there's something more subtle. And I'd like to finish my presentation with this. Hello to all the participants of our meeting. Thank you very much indeed for giving me the possibility to speak.
Thank you very much, Professor, for posing that question, but also enlarging our horizons. Now, I would like Professor Wojciech Świątkiewicz from our university. He's a psychologist and within broadly understood sociology of culture. He talks about the role of culture as part of integration, especially looking at lifestyle changes in culture, changing in the family, and also our orientation towards values. He talks about also various sociological and cultural processes of Upper Silesia. He has already looked after about 30 PhD students who received their PhD. Thank you very much for this introduction, but first of all, thank you very much to Professor George Weigel for a very interesting, however, for me, very synthetic but convincing display of continuity of teaching, maybe the way Professor Gumowa named it, social doctrine, because truly it creates a social doctrine. Professor showed us the canon of this doctrine. We've seen the history, how it has developed, and that was very interesting. Thank you very much for your lecture. I would like to refer to one theme that you, Professor, presented, talking about Centesimus Annus encyclical, while emphasizing that it is necessary to have this internal immanent connection between freedom and truth. So in this context, I would like to signal something that, in my opinion, is very interesting, but also it is very interesting for contemporary society issue. This is the issue that is presented by John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor. You briefly mentioned that encyclical as well when you emphasized the theme of the necessary immanent ties, connections between freedom and truth. I entitled my brief presentation the following way: the issue of social life in the 21st century is the cultural issue. I would like to refer to a category of thinking that John Paul II introduced during his speech during a meeting in Krakow on the occasion of the 600th anniversary of the Department of Theology of Jagiellonian University. In that speech, he talked about serving in thinking, and he said that there are very few things that are equally important as serving in your thinking, and this is nothing else but serving in the truth, in the social dimension. Every intellectual, regardless of their convictions, is also called to become a critical conscience regarding and with respect to everything that could lessen, diminish, or threaten the society. And this is what in Veritatis Splendor he refers to as the cultural issue. So the way we serve with thinking is being cultural. And so this is how we can differentiate ourselves from all of the other creatures in the world. So the service in thinking is something that is very important for the culture. So the status of culture that is built on the affirmation of a human being does not change the axiological dimensions, but only such that, in my opinion, a Polish philosopher, also from the Jagiellonian University, Professor Roman Ingarden, mentions, such axiological dimensions that are highly valuable, noble, beautiful, and good. If our works are highly valuable, beautiful, good, then also we become wiser and better. However, if they have elements of evil, lack of power, or madness, then they turn against the human being and lose their axiological determination. The very fact that culture develops, so the Pope, proves that in the human being there is something that is more than just human culture. It is the power of a human being. And this is why a human being does not become a prisoner of any of their culture. Quite the contrary, is able to strengthen this culture in accordance with its being and the being of the human being. The tragedy of the contemporary societies is that what we see as totalitarian and one-sided tendencies, they are not only shown as elements of traditions of values, and as such, they are well grounded and should be fully recognized by the society and its culture. In so many different trends of culture, we can see ways of thinking that go against the truth and attempt on a systematic level and in a systematic manner destroy culture. So they dissolve the connection between the human nature and conscience because they offer a new view and evaluation. Even though those trends are varied, they have one thing in common. They weaken or even negate the fact that freedom depends on culture, that there is a very strong connection on the truth, on the truth. So they remove the connection between the freedom and truth. They create a new interpretation of conscience when they don't talk about the truth, but about pragmatics and aims, referring to his great predecessors. Professor, you mentioned them, Leo XIII and Pius XI. These are the already mentioned Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno encyclicals. John Paul II confirmed that the social issue was already mentioned in Splendor. And so the cultural issue is the medium that is also filled by the faith. And we can see that faith and truth and faith and morality are being disconnected. And so the sense of morality is being disconnected from the religious sense. And the cultural issue is visible not only on habits, but also looking at the absolute level where the reason is responsible for everything, also for moral norms. So there are no moral norms, or in the moral norms, certainly there are no exceptions. We can see that in Veritatis Splendor, that creates the cultural issue dimension. And this is true both for individual life as well as the whole society. What we do at home and what we do publicly, what we do in public, at work, and also at home. This refers to scientists, business people, and individuals. So freedom is based on morality and truth, on those two pillars. If you do not recognize transcendental truth, then it leads you to looking at only your own benefits and your own views and not taking into consideration the rights of other people. Only such morality that always takes into consideration the rights of everyone, regardless of the political life and other issues, can be an ethical fundament of social life. And so the Pope adds that if transcendental truth does not exist in the society, then any other truth does not exist either. That would guarantee just relations amongst people. Problems of the contemporary world are coming from the fact that a lot of morality is being thrown away. There's no responsibility for words. There's no sense of common good. This is being alienated. And we also have desecration, which leads to dehumanization. Human being and the society that has no morality will become decadent. And this is from Veritatis Splendor. And so in brief, I just wanted to add it to what you, Professor, have mentioned. The cultural issue poses a challenge for the modern society. So the cultural issue is the contemporary issue of the society, just like it was different during Leon XIII's time and Pius XI's time. So if evil is defined as good, then this is the state of dictatorship, of relativism. So the issue of culture is an attempt to answer what is happening, what we are witnessing at the moment. Thank you very much, Professor.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be reminded you can pin in your question in a chat box. Yeah, just use the Q&A icon. This is the time for you to fill out this little questionnaire so that we've got your observations and questions that are the food for thought for the second part of the meeting. So you are more than welcome to use this opportunity. We've got a set of questions, but there might be more of them. And the third speaker in this series, ladies and gentlemen, Father Professor, who is the representative of our university, Arkadiusz Wuwer. He's a Katowice Archdiocese priest. He's got a PhD in humanities and sociology, senior PhD in Catholic teaching, church teaching of sociology. He's been an employee of our chair. He's the co-chair of Catholic teaching, social teaching of the church lecturers in Poland. He's the co-author, redactor, and author of 17 monographs and dozens of scientific papers. Arkadiusz Wuwer is interested in the history of social teaching of the church, evolution of social ideas, theoretical and practical dimensions, and practical applications in Upper Silesia. He's been sitting on many committees on the international arena. Father Professor, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Przemysław, for this presentation. Thank you very much indeed. I'm really pleased. I'd like to express my gratitude to Professor Weigel for his wonderful lecture. World-class, masterclass presentation. I'd like to thank the four speakers for complimenting and comments, their own reflections. It really enriches our meeting. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be one of the speakers. Well, these are large shoes to fill in, I'd say. This is a very important moment, not only to share our own reflections, but first and foremost to learn from the true master, Professor Weigel. Therefore, I've got two short observations and two short questions, because I'm truly honored to be here, and I would be even more honored if I were given the answer to the question. So let's jump into the heart of the problem. Professor, you were presenting social evolution, the evolution of the teaching and focusing on the doctrine. And you started with Leon XIII's Rerum Novarum of 1891. Quite right, because this encyclical is believed to be the first social one. However, I'd like to draw your attention to a little detail. The titles of encyclicas, as you know, are associated with the first words that open the encyclical in Latin. I was convinced that Leon XIII's encyclical, Rerum Novarum, the New Things, had this title because it was speaking about new social processes of the 19th century in a positive sense, the development of industry and the hopes attached to human optimism in a general sense. It came as a huge surprise to me when I was a student and I reached out for the original text of this encyclical. Only then did I discover that it started with a different sentence, different set of words. In Polish translation, it starts the desire for new things, craving for new things has shaken the world for a long time, was the Polish translation. So it was by no means a positive, but what is presented in Latin. Serum rovarum seme excitate acubimele. Cupidine creates the framework for social teaching of the church. This is what Benedict XVI used to relate to today's crisis of man and civilization. He found the root of this in cupiditas when he was referring to St. Arthur's theology of the 8th century. He was referring the Cupidita Treaty, and underscored that what is contained in the 10th commandment, none of the things that belong to somebody else is little paid attention to, because there's always the desire to have something at all costs, to become like God. This is the root of the crisis of today's civilization. And I checked the English text of Rerum Novarum. It's much milder because it speaks about the spirit of revolutionary changes. But brana, as they use in Italian, nothing said about this. So this is the first observation, which seems pretty interesting to me. And the second of my observations pertains to the questions that have appeared twice in Professor's comments. This word, social doctrine of the Church. This discussion has continued for a long time, but in the Polish language, we speak about 4 elements: social teaching of the Church, and we use notions like the Church has always had a social teaching. When they asked Jesus whether to pay taxes or not, it was the question that was a part of the social teaching of the Church, but it happened from time to time. Social Catholic of the teaching of the Church refers to a systematic system, end-to-end system that includes methodology and objective. We've got social Catholicism, quite practical one, but a doctrine is a comprehensive vision of social life presented by John Paul II, for example. Bearing in mind these distinctions, I believe that we can use all the terms, especially when we speak about what we use in Polish. I was supposed to be brief, so let's pose questions. Professor, the first question needs a broader introduction, but I think it is pretty important. I'm referring to social teaching of the Church, a systematic reflection upon the reality seen through the light of the Bible, as it is the case in different theological faculties. The proponents of this and those who study this are more often than not convinced that its methodological status is vague. We know that John Paul II, who is the main hero of today's meeting, was clear in his saying in Solicitudo Rei Socialis, number 41. It is repeated in Centesimus Annus, number 55. He clearly says, social teaching of the Church dissemination is a part of the preaching of the Church, of gospel. This is not ideology, but theology, moral theology domain. And the question that it brings about, in practice, those who deal with social teaching of the Church, the proponents, aren't they closer to sociology and political sciences rather than pastoral or moral theology? So the question, in what sense is social teaching of the Church is a theological science? Should it select, accept social studies through theology, or does it prefer to be a theological discipline that develops alongside empirical attitude? So what is God narrative in social teaching of the Church? So this is the first question. And the second question refers to the challenges and social reflection in the Church, namely social teaching of the Church in the perspective of the dynamic and the ever-changing reality and the events that are associated with the ever-changing reality. John Paul II in Solicitudo Rei Socialis number 3 highlights the fact that the social teaching of the Church is at the same time changing and still because it's been referring to the same gospel principles to assess what has been happening, but it's always dynamic, it's always new, because it's an in-depth study that is dictated by different conditions and historical conditions. So the questions, what new consequences of the course of event should the reflection of this Catholic social teaching of the Church should refer to in the first place? So are there elements of this kind of reflection, teaching of John Paul II that finished 15 years ago? The world was completely different. So we'd have to analyze this 15-year period, this gap sciences of the social teaching of the Church. Thank you very much for your attention. It is all that I wanted to say. Thank you very much. You can pose your questions. You can use the chat window for this purpose. So this is the time, Q&A, and you can pin in your question or your observation, your problem. Thank you very much, professors. Thank you very much for your contribution, for your interventions and your questions. And now the floor goes to Professor Weigel, the master of today's meeting.
Thank you very much to all of the colleagues for these very interesting comments. Let me respond in the order in which the three professors spoke. Professor Gamua raises a question that Father Vuver came back to at the end and that I think is quite important, and that is John Paul II's insistence that social doctrine is doctrine, which I take to mean his insistence that the social doctrine of the Church is truth-based. It emerges from a systematic reflection on truths that are rationally accessible. It's not simply political opinion or economic opinion or cultural opinion. It's a truth-based reflection on society. Now, to say that these truths are rationally accessible is very important in contemporary Western culture. Because to say that the truths of the social doctrine are rationally accessible, that we can know them by reason, is to say that we do not live in a random world. We do not live in a world in which we impose truth on reality. We live in a world in which the truths embedded in reality reveal themselves to us through a disciplined use of our reason, and as believers would say, through divine revelation, which purifies reason. The notion that social doctrine is doctrine or truth-based also tells us that we are living in a teleological world. This world is going somewhere. Things within this world have a proper end or a proper purpose. Now, this is a very key point of confrontation with today, with dominant Western culture today, which is a culture of no given ends, no ends or purposes embedded in reality, only my ends. Now, this is why it's important, I think, to recognize and to present the social doctrine in such a way that others recognize that these four foundational principles, personalism, common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity, all interact. They interact with each other in such a way as to offer a more comprehensive view of the human person and human society than we find in what is, I believe, the dominant model in contemporary Western culture, which the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor and others have described as expressive individualism. Or I explained to non-academic audiences the philosophy of Frank Sinatra, I did it my way. Expressive individualism really cannot account for society. expressive individualism is so individualistic that it creates an image of society as billiard balls randomly bouncing into each other on a billiard table. That is not a biblical view of the human condition. It's certainly not the Catholic social doctrine view of the human condition. And to challenge that view is one of the most important tasks of the social doctrine today. Professor Świątkiewicz reminds us very usefully and helpfully that John Paul II's social doctrine can be summed up in the phrase, culture comes first. Culture comes first. In speaking to audiences around the world about John Paul II's epic first pilgrimage to Poland in June 1979, I point out that in all of his public statements, I think there are 52 of them, he never discusses politics. He never discusses economics. It's all culture focused. And he was saying to the people of Poland he knew so well, you are not who they, the communists, say you are. Permit me to remind you who you are. You're a people formed by a distinctive culture with a distinctive history. At the center of that culture is your Catholic faith. If you reclaim that, you will find tools of resistance that communism cannot match. So this notion of culture first was not simply a theoretical matter for John Paul II. It was, in fact, his grand strategy for the social doctrine of the church. Now, all of this is another significant challenge to the dominant culture of today. The notion, I think, is widespread throughout the Western world that any culture can sustain democracy. That's simply not true. Not every culture can sustain democracy. Some cultures undermine democracy. Or to borrow a phrase from Professor Świątkiewicz, decadence destroys democracy. I have long thought, based on my study of his writing as well as my personal interaction with him, that John Paul II came to this view by reflecting upon the experience of Weimar Germany, the Germany between the First and Second World Wars. Weimar Germany had a beautifully constructed democratic constitution. One of the fathers of modern sociology, Max Weber, was one of the authors of the Weimar Constitution. So the machinery was there, but the machinery was insufficient to resist the pressures of the Great Depression and other pressures. And that machinery eventually produced a totalitarian system, the Third Reich. Why? Because the culture was insufficient. The political culture of the time, the moral culture of the time, the public moral culture of the time was insufficient to resist the temptations of totalitarianism. I think the Weimar example was very prominent, at least in the background of John Paul II's thinking, not least because he had suffered the effects of the collapse of Weimar personally in his experience of the Second World War. Father Wöver made any number of interesting points. I was very pleased to see what I think is a copy of the Polish edition of Witness to Hope behind him on his bookcase. It's always good to see one's books 3,500 miles away. That was a very interesting reminder of how Rerum Novarum actually begins. It doesn't begin with a celebration of these new things. They are clearly ambiguous at best in the mind of Leo XIII. However, Leo XIII was not Pius IX. Leo XIII came to the papacy in 1878 with a settled view that the church could no longer just say no, nie, to modernity in all its forms. The church had to engage the modern world in order to convert the modern world. And the church needed distinctively Catholic tools in order to do that. It is not an accident that during his decades as the Bishop of Perugia in Italy, the man who became Leo XIII, Cardinal Pecci, created what he called a Thomistic academy in Perugia to study closely the work of St. Thomas Aquinas. And that work, which, as I think all of us know, was not only philosophically grounded, but biblically grounded, scripturally grounded, contained a kind of incipient or in vitro social doctrine. There's a lot about the proper ordering of states and their interaction in Thomas Aquinas. So when Leo XIII comes to the chair of Peter, he's got a formed view of the fundamental principles that are necessary to make any society, the older regimes or the new regimes, work properly. Now, I was very grateful to Father Wöver as well for tying the witness of the Bible to the social doctrine. The beginning, for example, of Catholic teaching on religious freedom is obviously the Lord's injunction to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, which means that there are things of God's that are not things of Caesar's, which means that Caesar has limited power. That's a crucial moment in the evolution of the entire body of Western thought about the individual and society. It's not just a crucial Christian moment, but it is a Christian moment. And this suggests to me something about the pastoral requirements of the present. Catholic social doctrine, both in its biblical roots and its theological development, is largely unknown among most Catholics. There is a great work of catechesis necessary in the church today. Our teachers, and if I may say, our preachers, our homilists, priests in the pulpit, bishops in their teaching role, must help our people see the world through biblical lenses and through the lenses of the social doctrine, because that is the necessary corrective to this expressive individualism, which is eroding the cultural foundations of freedom lived nobly throughout the Western world. I believe that theology, as it has long been in dialogue with philosophy, must also, in the development of Catholic social thought, be in dialogue with the social sciences, with sociology, political theory, political science, etc. This reflects, I think, a necessary empirical sensitivity that we see in a striking way in John Paul II's Centesimus Annus. One of the oddities of the social doctrine from Rerum Novarum to John the 23rd's 1961 encyclical Mater et Magistra is it had a kind of materialistic view of wealth, which I mentioned in my opening remarks. Wealth is land or the possession of resources, and there's a fixed amount of wealth. A very materialistic idea of wealth. John Paul II's empirical sensitivity led him to understand that that's not the way wealth happens in the world of the late 20th century. It's not a fixed amount of material. It's a growing reality in which human creativity plays at least as large a role as resources and land, etc. Finally, Father asked the question, the social doctrine of John Paul II is now older. Centesimus Annus will be 30 years old next May. What does that mean? Well, the first thing it means to me is that the church needs to learn it. I don't think the church throughout the world has really come to grips in a serious way with the social doctrine of John Paul II, and especially with Centesimus Annus. Secondly, it means we should recognize how prescient, or if you prefer, prophetic, John Paul II was in seeing that culture is the key to living freedom nobly and to avoiding the decadence that can destroy democracy and the free economy. That was remarkably insightful 30 years ago, when, as today, many people were of the view that getting society properly organized simply means getting the machinery of democracy and the market properly organized. John Paul II knew that just was not true, that the culture was the key, and at the center of culture was virtue. People living the virtues that make freedom possible in a noble way. So, while his most developed social encyclical may be 30 years old, it was remarkably, even astonishingly insightful into the future, which is now. Because this problem of decadence, I believe, is the key problem confronting the democratic world today. Most of us, I expect, are not altogether happy with the way political life is lived in our various countries. I know I'm not happy about the situation here in the United States. But as I tell my audiences here, if the politics are not good, that's because the political culture is not good. And if the political culture is not good, that is because the public moral culture is deficient. So culture first is a crucial insight that the church brings to the debate over the future of freedom in the world today. Thank you.
Szanowni prelegenci, bardzo dziękujemy za wzięcie.
Dear speakers, thank you very much for taking part in this discussion, for all of the questions and comments that have been directed at our guest. Before we continue with our meeting, I would like to officially welcome Professor Ewa Jarosz, the Pro-Rector for the Development of Human Resources at the University of Katowice of the Silesian University. She specializes in children's rights and also in education and upbringing. Professor, the floor is yours. I am really sorry for being late. I would like to start with that because I have been excluded for technical reason. Exclusion has a digital face these days, and that's what has happened to me. Ladies and gentlemen, of behalf of Professor Weigel and also on behalf of the University of Silesia and also all of other rectors and deans, I would like to really welcome you to this conference that is presented digitally. I would like to greet all of the speakers. I would like to also thank the organizers. I would like to also greet the great Chancellor of the Institute of Theology of the University of Silesia. That is Archbishop Victor Skwoc, Professor Jacek Kempa, and also all of the employees and lecturers, as well as all of the students of the university present here and also organizing this event. I hope that such initiatives will be active for many years to come, because such events also promote our university also outside of Poland. This is why I see this initiative as extremely valuable also because on such occasions we can meet the masters, because master classes gather many different great thinkers from around the globe. So I know that this is very valuable to all of the participants, but at this point I would like to greet and also thank Professor George Weigel from Washington, D.C., because it is for us a great opportunity to meet such a personality. For us from Katowice at the University of Silesia, it is a great opportunity to meet you. I have been present here for quite a while now, and I have been listening to what you have been saying. So it has been extremely interesting from the cognitive point of view, very interesting discussions, and from what I can sense, positive emotions. It is not just about the subject matter that's very close to our hearts, but the very occasion and possibility to see each other that is rare, that we can look each other in the eye, that we can greet each other, we can send support and show that we are connected after all. And first of all, it is so important for us that we can carry on conducting research, share the results. So this is a great opportunity that we use the means that we have, that we continue all of such activities. Thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for being able to listen to such interesting discussions. I know that we are going to continue, and I do hope that we will be able to hold other master classes so that as big a number of our lecturers and students of our university will be able to participate. Thank you very much. Greetings once again. Thank you very much. And I will stay with you a little while longer. Thank you very much, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Hereby, we have concluded this part of our meeting. Please be back at 5:10 Warsaw time. 5:10 in 15 minutes time, we are going to reconvene for the second part of our meeting. Thank you very much. Welcome you to the second part of our webinar. And in the second part, we would like to have a dialogue with our guest, with Professor Weigel. And you have sent us a lot of questions. We would like some of you to ask these questions personally. We've asked that you would like to do it personally. And I'm going to read out the names, and we will ask you to be very disciplined when it comes to time. You have 1 minute, more or less 1 minute. But just at the beginning of your question, please state in which language you are going to speak, because we have interpretation. We have got 3 languages here: English, Polish, and Italian. So we will need to have a short leeway due to interpretation. So there's going to be a short break, and then we are going to ask Professor Weigel to answer. So I would like to begin with Giovanna Marina Podino, and she represents the Serena Institute. Professor, we would like you to switch your microphone on. Bardzo dziękuję, dziękuję serdecznie. Ja będę mówiła w języku włoskim. Dobrze? It is not so much a question, it is my impression, and I would like to share it with Professor Weigel. I am not a specialist in the history of the church. I specialize more in the Bible, but John Paul II was the Pope of my youth, and what was my reflection, what sprang to my mind, was the historical background of Karol Wojtyła. As a young man and then as a priest, he experienced 2 totalitarian systems, and this is what Professor Weigel mentioned. It was Nazism and socialism, communism. These 2 systems negated God, and from the negation of God, it led to the negation of a human being and society. So I lived in Czechoslovakia, so I know what it means, and this experience really influenced Karol Wojtyła, later John Paul II. So the encyclicals also reflected, and as Professor Weigel mentioned, from the encyclicals of John Paul II, we can see the 2 pillars. It is the human dignity, that the human being was created as the image of God, and also the dignity of life in the society. the dignity of the human being. And these two elements really are intertwined. They are deeply rooted in God who is love, who is the King of history, as well as in truth, in beauty, and in the goodness of our God. But these two pillars of the human being and also the society, they go through many thoughts of John Paul II. And this is what I wanted to share. Maybe Professor Weigel could maybe say a few words and confirm whether this came from the love of God, whether you can confirm this thought, this transcendence, and this being intertwined. You have the dignity of life of a human being and also the life of the society. Thank you very much.
Profesor Ewę Borkowską.
Thank you very much, Professor, for these words. Now we would like Professor Borkowska to take the floor. You come from the Department of Humanities of the University of Silesia. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Speaking English, if possible. I'd like to thank you, Professor, for every single word that you pronounced, for every single word that you preached. As a teacher and a preacher at the same time, I'm well familiar with your being a great scholar, American scholar, and I'd like to thank you. I feel very emotional at the moment, but I think it's because of John Paul II, and I belong to this generation of John Paul II. I would like to thank you for insisting on the word culture, which you also raised in the introduction to your book, The Fragility of Order. And there you just tie culture with cult, because it is a part of this nice word, culture. Cult is a part of culture. I would like to thank you for the word teleological, and which is connected with theological, but of course telos in the sense of eschaton, for instance, which is the end, the purpose. I thank you very much for expressive individualism, since you're definitely interested in poetry, because you mentioned also William Butler Yeats and his wonderful poem called The Second Coming. In the introduction to The Fragility of Order, and you're talking about anarchy, and you're talking about the center of a world which is falling apart, and we can see it nowadays even. So you're very poetic, and I think it was a great influence of St. John Paul II, who was also a poet himself. In 1978, when I was writing my MA dissertation, I mentioned during those times of dark night of communism, I mentioned John Paul II, and I managed to get a translation of his poem, which is called The Thought is the Strange Space, which I also included in my MA dissertation. I wish to thank you for talking about the dialogue between theology and philosophy. I myself am a philologist, so very sensitive to words, philos logos, as you know very well. Thank you very much for your my question, because I don't want to get too much. My question is, how much were you influenced by the poetry of John Paul II? Because he himself was an actor partly, he was also a poet. How much were you influenced by his Polish identity? That is what I would like to know. And do you understand a little bit of Polish? Of course, he's translated, and you definitely read everything in English. But I think there is this scintilla of Polishness that always sparkles through his writing, be it encyclicals, poetry, his writing, his sermons, his speeches, and everything else. Thank you very much one more time. I don't know how to express my thanks. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. To było wszystko. Dziękuję uprzejmie.
Let me just speak to the first two speakers briefly here. Giovanna Maria raised a very interesting point that was made by Karol Wojtyła's friend, Father Henri de Lubac, one of the great theological figures at the Second Vatican Council, who wrote in his book, The Drama of Atheistic Humanism, it is not true that men cannot organize the world without God. They can. What is true is that when men try to organize the world without God, they can only organize it against each other. I think Wojtyła understood that intellectually. He certainly understood it from his own experience. It's important to remember that Centesimus Annus in 1991 begins with an analysis of the anthropological error of communism. Communism was not just stupid economics, it was not just brutal politics. The fundamental problem was it got the anthropology wrong. It got the idea of the human person wrong. And that is a method of analysis. What's the implicit anthropology that can be applied to any social system or any nation today? And I believe that, as I said at the end of the first session, that the fundamental problem in the Western world today is one of public moral culture, and at the heart of that is an anthropological problem, this problem of expressive individualism. Professor Borkowska, thank you very much for all those kind words. I actually, in the course of preparing Witness to Hope, worked with Sister Amelia Ehrlich, a friend of John Paul II's, to retranslate his poetry. The English translations are generally quite bad. Pope himself said that. So Sister Amelia and Amelia was his tutor in English, retranslated all of that poetry because that was very important for getting to him from the inside. When we say that John Paul II's Polish identity was crucial to his understanding of things, I think we need to understand that in a particularly Catholic sense. In the Catholic understanding of these things, we come to universal loves through particular loves. Therefore, John Paul II's Polishness did not narrow him, it opened him. And that needs to be stressed, I think, through his particular immersion in the literary culture of Poland. He came to the understanding of universal truths about the human condition.
Dziękujemy, panie profesorze.
Thank you very much, Professor, indeed. And now the floor goes to Professor Leszek Roszkowski, a physicist from Nuclear Study Center.
First of all, let me express my gratitude to Professor Weigel, especially, and also to the other panelists for their very insightful thoughts. Thank you also to the University of Silesia, represented here by Madam Prorector, and last but not least by the organizers of the event. I'm very happy to meet you here all in person, of course, in a new way. As a scientist working in the area of natural sciences, in physics, especially the area of Big Bang, where obviously natural questions arise of theological nature, I'd like to make a few comments on the attitude of John Paul II on the mutual relations between science and religion, because I believe he made some important contributions in this area. In short, John Paul II stated, both faith and science are gifts from God. He put them on equal footing. At least I, as a scientist, read it this way. It's a very important statement. Science and religion are both gifts from God. As such, a religious person has nothing to fear from scientific findings then. science often sets challenges, big challenges to our religious views. Let me quote the example of the Darwinian hypothesis of biological evolution, or in physics, for example, quantum phenomena and the theory of relativity that by many were interpreted as putting into question the concept of objective truth. So there are many challenges that arise to religion from science, at least to our understanding of religion. John Paul II was perhaps not unique, but certainly exceptional in his openness to science. He was, to mention one aspect, he was bold and humble enough to address the painful and controversial issue of Galileo Galilei half a millennium ago. He rehabilitated Galileo in 1992 and was open to the discussion and to the criticism that erupted in the media and not only of the church and all that surrounded it. The vindicating of Galileo was given very high publicity by the media. A discussion erupted on the contradictions of science and religion and all that stuff. In this context, I would like to stress that science equally, perhaps even more, sets a challenge to the materialistic approach. That is something that is less well orchestrated. Atheists of today are not that open to discuss them. Ironically, it seems to be the church, at least some members of the church, that are more open to discuss the mutual challenges that religion and science pose to each other. As a side remark, let me just state that it's very sad that we have witnessed the recent attacks on John Paul II's noble name, that have started again, this time in the context of the McCarrick affair. But coming back to science and religion, in short, John Paul II put a dialogue between science and religion on a completely new level of much more openness, at least on the side of the Catholic Church. The response from scientists has been mixed, at least on the side of materialists. And I believe that this is the area where actually lay Catholics who are engaged in science have an important role to play. And this also relates to the social aspect of teachings of John Paul II that are the main theme of today's event. In this context, I'd like to mention the Society of Catholic Scientists that started in the United States in 2016. The society hopes to address the call of Pope John Paul II that members of the Church who are active scientists be of service to those who are attempting to integrate the worlds of science and religion in their own intellectual and spiritual lives. I quoted it from the vision from the website of the society. The society was started by Professor Stephen Barr in the United States. Has now over 1,600 members, 80% of them in North America, mostly in the United States.
Dziękujemy, panie profesorze. Prosilibyśmy o postawienie pytania, przepraszam.
Thank you, Professor. Time to conclude.
Chapter of this society is now starting in Poland. I would like to thank Professor Weigel again and ask you if you could perhaps express your views on this issue of science and religion. Thank you. Sorry for speaking so long.
Thank you. I'm very happy that you concluded, Professor, by mentioning my good friend, Professor Stephen Barr.
And also my good friend.
We're in close touch frequently, and that's a very important initiative that he's launched. It's part of a broader pattern, though. I was told some years ago that the fastest growing section of the American Physics Association is the Association of Christian Physicists, who are Protestants as well as Catholics. And this, I think, raises an interesting point that perhaps takes us a bit beyond John Paul II. I mean, his dialogue with science, particularly in the Castel Gandolfo seminars, tended to focus on what we call here hard science: physics, chemistry, astronomy, etc. It's in those worlds today, it seems to me, that there is more of an openness to a dialogue with religious conviction. The problem is in what we call the soft sciences: biology, genetics, et cetera, et cetera. This is where we've got serious problems of the sort raised in Evangelium Vitae. So that's worth thinking about for the future. One point I make to audiences, most recently in a lecture in Jerusalem a couple of years ago, when this question of science and religion came up, I said, look, the two most important scientific events of the past 200 years were the two most important developments in science that have the biggest impact on how we think about things were the cracking of the human genetic code, beginning with the unraveling of the DNA double helix and modern genetics, and of course, nuclear physics and its profound effect on world politics. And I pointed out to this audience that both of those developments began with Catholic priests. Gregor Mendel is the father of modern genetics, and Joseph Lemaitre is the father of the Big Bang theory. So if you take that little piece of modern history seriously, it clearly suggests that these are fields with a great overlap of interest and the possibility of a real conversation. So it's only people of seriously closed minds who don't understand that. Finally, I think the question Professor Roszkowski raised, how was it that John Paul II was so open to science? I think the answer is not complicated. He was convinced, both as a man of the Bible and as a philosopher, that all truths, if they're really true, tend toward the one truth, capital T, who is God. Like iron shavings tend toward a magnet, all truths from whatever source, if they're really true, whether that's science, literature, whatever, math, point towards or are ordered towards the one truth, who is God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. That was the source of his openness.
Thank you very much.
Dziękujemy, panie profesorze.
Thank you very much, Professor. And Raul Silva from Portugal will take the floor. And then Jarosław Chorowski of Nicolaus Copernicus University in Toruń. Would you be please time disciplined? And thank you very much. Mr. Silva, the floor is yours.
Ecco, pur essendo portoghese, parlo in italiano.
I'll be speaking Italian. I returned to 2005, the last days of John Paul II, and the huge crowd of people that was gathered for John Paul II's funeral. And the question that popped out at that time, if it was some other pope, would this pope leave this kind of heritage? He was a truly great pope. we can see that this is truly divine God's church, and God plays the main role here. So I'd like to express my gratitude to Professor Weigel for his presentation and for the biography of John Paul II. It was my true joy to read this. My quest about information about John Paul II, there is a specific detail that attracted my attention. His meeting with Wanda Pułtawska. Wanda Pułtawska described this in her book on recollections, Beskidzkie Rekolekcje, Beskid Mountains Recollections. John Paul II didn't suffer the same as she did. And I'm Afraid of the Dreams, another book of Professor Pułtawska, gave me a deeper understanding. My understanding was even deeper when I visited Dachau concentration camp. I was truly impressed by the solidarity between Protestants and Catholic inmates. It was a special moment for the life of the church. And it seems to me the mystery of suffering had accompanied John Paul II throughout his life. He was very attentive to it. He listened to this experience very much. It reminds of a Holy Mother. Totus tuus was his motto. It comes as no coincidence. Therefore, his social teaching seems to explain the Magnificat and all the arguments and topics related to Magnificat.
Senza volere prendere possesso di espressioni di Papa Francesco, ma mi sembra che in Giovanni Paolo II è molto forte.
I wouldn't like to trivialize the expression of the current Pope Francis, but you can see this mysticism of a meeting, of an encounter with John Paul II. His teaching springs from reality, considering all the elements, relations to all milieus, the dialogue between people, dialogue between East and West, dialogue between North and South, encounter of a man and a woman, meeting of a man and a woman. These are quite apparent in his teaching. So, any comment about this Holy Mother related theme in his teaching? Any comments on that? Professor, do you want to answer the question now, or are we going to take one more question?
I'll answer it very briefly. I think one of the most important of John Paul II's apostolic letters was the apostolic letter Salvifici Doloris, Redemptive Suffering, where he makes the point that only human beings suffer. Animals experience pain, but only human beings suffer, which means that suffering has a spiritual dimension. And the Christian answer to the problem of suffering, to the mystery of suffering, is not a theoretical answer. It's an existential answer. Indeed, it's a biblical answer. The Christian response to the mystery of suffering is to tell the world that God entered this world in the person of the second person of the Trinity, born as Jesus of Nazareth, which we'll celebrate in 10 days. God enters the world of suffering and transforms it, not by avoiding it, but by embracing it and transforming it through self-giving love in the sacrifice of the cross, which is answered by the resurrection, which is what, by the way, we celebrate at Holy Mass every day.
Dziękujemy, panie profesorze. Mamy w tej chwili pytanie księdza arcybiskupa Damiana
Thank you,
Zimonia.
Professor. The question from Archbishop Damian Zimion. Father Dr. Ledwoń will read that out.
Pytanie brzmi następująco.
And the question is as follows. Dear Professor Judge Weigel, how do you assess the teaching of the social doctrines during the pilgrimages to Piekary Śląskie? You, Professor, attended such a pilgrimage in 2008. And now there is a question from Professor Jarosław Chorowski from the University of Nicholas Copernicus in Toruń.
Thank you very much indeed for the possibility of posing this question and deep thoughts. My question pertains to pedagogy. Professor, you have diagnosed today's culture and society and its in-depth insight. So first, I'll ask a question and give extra context to this question. What is the potential of today's culture when it comes to morality shaping of today's man? It pertains to what you said. In this doctrine on democracy, free market, there is yet one element, moral virtues. You used moral virtues on a number of occasions. You also mentioned the virtues of reason, but also the virtues of the will that need to be developed. Not only do we speak about understanding and comprehension, but about triggering some internal change in man. In the discussion, there was this tip, much there is to be done by the church when it comes to giving this doctrine, this teaching to today's man. Indeed, Thomism was also born in the context of fideism and in the context of attempts to bring together Christian line of thinking with the then achievements of culture. This is what John Paul II clearly says. When it comes to virtues, when it comes to the changes instilled in man, they are in the context of common acting, trying to attain common good. Now the question, today's culture, culture of individualism, of egoism, the culture of pondering your whims and needs, your own needs. Can this culture shape this attitude such as care for others, responsibility? Is it possible? Thank you, Professor. Professor Weigel, would you like to answer the question now?
Yeah, yes. Thank you, Professor Chorowski. The short answer to your question is nie. No. I think that's fairly obvious, although it's not obvious to the high culture of the West. Expressive individualism is a poison that is eroding first the public moral culture of our societies, and I think now the political culture of our societies. What's the answer to this? The answer is what was called in the 1980s, leading up to the revolution of 1989, living in the truth. We have to set about the task of converting the culture. The church has to set about the task of converting the culture. And this brings me back, by the way, to something I meant to mention to Professor Roszkowski. One of the most important things about the development of the Society of Catholic Scientists or this Association of Christian Physicists is the possibility of converting the culture. The research data we have here tells us that, at least in the United States, I suspect this is true in many other contexts. The primary reason young people give for a lack of interest in religion, in the church, is the conviction, their conviction or their assumption that science has settled all the great questions. Now, if they hear from scientists that no, science does not answer all the great questions, it in fact opens up a whole arena of more interesting questions, that may be a help. Back to Professor Horowski, I am going to send Professor Kwas-Szczepanska a paper I delivered virtually in Krakow a month ago at the John Paul II days. It's about looking at the future through the eyes of John Paul II. I'm assuming that the Silesian University has everybody's email address here, because that's how you got onto this program. I'm going to send Alexandra this paper with the request that she send it to everyone who's on the webinar here, and that'll help continue the conversation along the lines that Professor Horowski was outlining.
Panie profesorze, jeszcze to pytanie tutaj może nie...
Professor, now also regarding the question of Archbishop, would you like to answer
yes.
it now?
Yes, I'm sorry. First of all, hello, Archbishop Zeman. It's lovely to be with you again. I'm most grateful for your hospitality in Katowice several years ago. I think if one goes back through those talks of John Paul II at Piacari, you see elements that would eventually find their way into Laborum Exercens. In other words, Laborum Exercens is not simply Wojtyła's reflection on his own experience as a worker. It reflected his experience of dealing with working people pastorally and homiletically, as he did at Piacari. Now, I have not candidly made a close study of all of those texts, but I am sure that if you look through them, you will see the key themes that would emerge in Laborum Exercens present even in the 1970s. Work as a participation in God's ongoing creation of the world. Work has a spiritual dimension. Identifying the hardship of work with the suffering of Christ is a way of participating in Christ's ongoing redemption of the world. I'm quite confident all of those themes were there. So thank you for raising that point, and thank you again for bringing me to Katowice for a memorable weekend several years ago.
Dziękujemy, panie profesorze. Drodzy państwo, pytań jest bardzo wiele.
Thank you very much, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a multitude of questions, but please allow us to give the floor to Dr. Robert Young, because he's calling all the way from Kenya. He comes originally from Ireland, but he's calling from Kenya.
I live in Africa. Do you see, or what do you think Pope John Paul II's social doctrine has to say to the African continent in the 21st century? Thank you.
Thank you, Father. As you know, John Paul II was fascinated by Africa and Africans. This began at the Second Vatican Council. It continued throughout his pontificate. Some of his closest associates, Cardinal Gantine, Cardinal Arinze, were Africans. I think he spent as much time in Africa as on any other non-European continent he visited. I think he was impressed by the New Testament vitality of the church in Africa. I have experienced this personally in the last 2 major synods in Rome, where I was working with Anglophone bishops from Africa, and found in them a vitality of faith, a commitment to Catholic truth that was really very inspiring. And there is a sense in which the future of the world church is going to be defined in Africa over the 21st century. This is quite an astonishing development, but it is a fruit of the work of many missionaries over the past century and a half. But I think it's a particular fruit of the interest of John Paul II in Africa. And I think what he said about politics, economics, culture, all has implications for the church's social witness in Africa, where there, as I don't need to tell you, there's a great struggle to establish stable democratic forms of government and to get beyond traditional forms of, how to put this delicately, corruption in economic life. So I am in regular touch with African theologians, and I hope when international travel resumes in a more normal way, that I'll be able to accept their invitations to come to Africa to speak precisely about the things we've been speaking about today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Dziękujemy, panie profesorze.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, Robert. Unfortunately, time flies, and that happens especially when there is a very interesting lecture. So before we limit our questions, we are going to give the floor to Andrea Blaszke from the Ecumenical Life Center in Otmering, and then Roberto Catalano from the area of interreligious dialogue. Andrea first, and then Roberto. Please state the language that you are going to use. I am going to speak Italian. So first of all, I would like to thank you for your words, Professor, but first of all, I would like to thank you for your involvement and engagement. I have a question regarding our reality, because we do live in a global village. We are not all Christians. When I was small, I was really fascinated by the figure and character of John Paul II. I was fascinated by how open he was, how much respect he had towards the human being. He always invited people that were close to his heart. And I would like to say that the social doctrine is very important to all of us. However, there are also projects that are aimed at deepening this knowledge, but we can also do it amongst ourselves. We can analyze the rules, and we can shed a new light onto what is called the common good. There are such projects, and there is a growing interest in such projects, and I believe that they can be implemented right away.
I will speak in English. Is it okay? Thank you very much again for your interesting presentation. As it was mentioned before, my area is interreligious dialogue and missiology. So John Paul II was a giant in both these fields, and there is no need to comment about it. It is not even the topic of today. Nevertheless, the world has changed drastically from the time John Paul II is no longer with us. And today we have a completely different picture, not only because of the pandemic, but because of so many complicated situations in the world, which the pandemic has further complicated. Now, Pope Francis has come out recently with a real social teaching with the Fratelli Tutti. My question is very short and very sharp. Do you see any continuity or discontinuity between the teaching of John Paul II and the teaching of Pope Francis, always keeping into account that in the church there is always an evolution in the sense of continuity? But nevertheless, John Paul II and Pope Francis come from two different historical moments, two different geographical, socio-political, and also ecclesial experiences. So this is the point I would like to have your mind about. Thank you very much.
Dziękujemy, panie doktorze. Panie profesorze, zechce pan nam odpowiedzieć? Nie wiem, jak pan to zrobi, mamy już niewiele czasu.
Professor, can you answer this question? We are running out of time, but we can make it.
Yeah, very quickly. To Andrea Blaszke, thank you. Why is John Paul II open to everyone? Because he knew that everyone is a someone for whom the Son of God entered the world, suffered, died, and was raised from the dead. That's the root of John Paul II's openness. That has a very important message for today. We're often told by our culture that Christian conviction narrows us. The truth of the matter is that authentic Christian conviction expands human sympathies, expands our capacity to empathize with others. It doesn't narrow it, it expands it. Now, we have to display that in our lives, but we also have to proclaim it. And he did that by the quality of his life and his dialogue with others. Thank you, Professor Catalano. Good to see you. I would say that Pope Francis teaches in a very unique way. It's not the teaching of the kind of intellectual that John Paul II was. It's more pastoral than theoretical, although John Paul II was certainly pastoral as well. I also will have to say, and I say this respectfully, I know Pope Francis. I've had 3 extended conversations with him since he's been Pope. I knew him in Buenos Aires. He brings to this task a somewhat less broad life experience than John Paul II. And that tends to make his social teaching very much reflective of his own experience in Argentina, for example, where, to take an obvious point, he never experienced a developed, properly functioning democracy or market economy. Now, you could say John Paul II didn't either. But John Paul II was a genuine intellectual who knew how to get outside his own experience and look at things from a fresh perspective. Your interest in interreligious dialogue, I think, is obviously one shared by both John Paul II and Pope Francis. I think one of the great tragedies of recent Catholic history, post-John Paul II Catholic history, is the way that most of the world has ignored Pope Benedict's Regensburg lecture, which was dismissed by the world media as deprecatory of Islam. That's simply not true. What Pope Benedict was saying was that, look, it took the Catholic Church about 200 years to figure out democracy, human rights, religious freedom, and to do that in a Catholic way. The Catholic endorsement of religious freedom today is not a surrender to Enlightenment philosophy. It's an authentic Catholic development. Now, that experience might be of some use to Muslims who wish to develop from within their own religious tradition an Islamic case for religious tolerance and for the distinction of religious and political authority in a just society. That remains to be done. That challenge remains to be taken up. And I hope that the new emphasis that Pope Francis has put on interreligious dialogue will flow along those lines.
Dziękujemy, panie profesorze. Szanowni państwo, nasz czas się
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. And now I would like to extend a request to Robert Sababadi, who is looking after the technical aspect. So now if you could show on the screen Magdalena and David, I would like to extend my thanks to Magdalena. Because if you've received all of the invitations, then it is thanks to Magdalena and David. Magdalena and David were also analyzing all of the questions. Professor Weigel, maybe you will have the possibility to answer these questions, but as a publication in our periodical, in our magazine. So thank you very much. And I would like to also thank you, and I would like to give the floor to Professor Kempa. So in the program, I'm supposed to draw conclusions. It is impossible to summarize this lecture. I would like to thank everyone for your participation. I would like to thank Professor Weigel first of all, and like to emphasize something that may not be rational, but I would like to say that this was a very emotional, this was an exciting meeting. It was really engaging emotionally, and the content is very important to us, and we could see that a few times during the meeting. And when it comes to the content, then I would like to emphasize this moment that, of course, there was the question about how relevant is the teaching of John Paul II, how relevant, how up-to-date is it when referring to the current situation, because the times have changed when it comes to the society, but also in other dimensions as well. And well, our discussion today certainly shows a basic thing, that the teachings of John Paul II, especially the social doctrine, aids us when it comes to diagnosing the current situation. And I was looking at this discussion from my own perspective and my own interest in research and other interests. And so please allow me to just say three things, because we talk not only about the fundamental aspects of the teachings of the church, but certain points that I would call the hinges for the universalization for teaching based on faith. So this is a question about the relation between the universal mind or ratio and theological mind. So how can we look at this universal democratic discourse? For example, whether in democracy we would be able to get a consensus that freedom requires faith, and then we still have the question of the truth itself. When we talk about the moral order that is necessary for democracy to survive and to develop, we could agree that yes, a moral organization is important, but there's always the question of the content of this moral order. This is what I call this hinge between the inspiration coming from the faith in the teachings of John Paul II that reflects universal teaching, and this is the question regarding how this teaching of universal character, how to translate it, how to move it to the public domain, because we see that it enters the discourse all around the globe and certain conclusions are drawn. This is something that we also tried to do today, and we hope that we have managed to contribute at least a little bit to the debate. It is a pity that we were unable to answer all of the questions that have been submitted in writing, but we hope that we will be able to answer them at a later stage. Thank you very much, Professor, for our meeting today. I would like to thank all of you, all of the participants from so many regions of Poland and the globe. I would like to thank all of the Professor Wiesław Gumuła, Professor Wojciech Świątkiewicz, Professor Arkadiusz Wuwer. I would like to thank also those chairing today's meeting, so Mariola Kozubek and Aleksandra Kłos-Skrzypczak. I would like to thank Reverend Przemysław Sawa and also Magdalena and Reverend David have already been mentioned, and I would like to thank our technical support. And last but not least, as we say in Old Polish, I would like to thank all of the interpreters who have made it possible to take active part in this case. On the 25th of February, we are going to hold another meeting, and now I will only tell you that we are going to send you more information about that soon. So from Katowice, God bless, see you soon, and stay healthy and stay well.
Well, the last word has to be a word of thanks to everyone who organized this and participated in it all around the world. It's great to be in contact with friends and colleagues, particularly at this challenging time. Let us pray that through the intercession of Pope St. John Paul II, we will all be empowered to be the witnesses to the gospel of life and the social doctrine of the church that we're called to be. I'd like to wish everyone here a happy and holy Christmas, and I look forward to seeing many of you in person in a post-plague world. Thanks very much.